The Sceptical Chymist, a short essay written and read by Bruce Mills, otherwise known as the Obligate Pedestrian. Robert Boyle published The Sceptical Chymist in 1661. The Hermetic tradition, including Aristotle, promotes the principle that the prime materials are earth, water, air, and fire. This idea goes back to the Greco-Roman period of Egypt. The idea of a prime material is mostly the same as what, in the 21st century, is thought of as a fundamental particle, although it is probably better said that it is the fundamental field rather than the particle, which is a linear mode in the field. The Spagorist tradition, which is of much later origin, with Paracelsus in the 1500s in Europe, says that the prime materials are salt, sulfur, and mercury. This is related to the midway theory of metallurgy, involving sulfur and mercury as the prime materials from which all other things are made by combination. Spagyria is a method developed by Paracelsus involving separating materials into the tria prima, salt, sulfur, and mercury, and then recombining them to make other materials. To distinguish these ideas is often used the terms the four materials and the three principles. But conceptually they are two theories that specify the prime materials or fundamental fields. The designation of some materials as prime is very much an ontological position rather than a position of empirical science. In linear systems theory, it is common to use sine and cosine as the prime functions, the basis functions, for the space of all sinusoids. However, sine and cosine rotated by 45 degrees would do equally well, as would an infinity of other options. In Summa Perfectionis, circa 1305, Pseudo-Geber explicitly states that the sulfur and mercury are combinations of the four materials earth, water, air, and fire. But this does not exclude the principle that earth, water, air, and fire might be describable as combinations of salt, sulfur, and mercury. In 20th and 21st century particle physics, there is a concept called particle democracy. The idea has come up several times. It means essentially that rather than there being a specific set of particles that are fundamental, and so ontologically distinct in actually existing, there are no truly fundamental particles, but rather a choice of which particles to base a theory on, a matter of convention and convenience. In the paper Duality and Particle Democracy, Studies in History and Philosophy of Science, Part B, Studies in History and Philosophy of Modern Physics, 2017, Ilana Castellani writes about the philosophical impact of duality in string theory. Duality is essentially just the recognition that two very different theories on very different spaces can be dual in the sense of providing exactly the same empirical conclusions. It is like the idea of logarithms turning multiplication into addition, or Fourier transforms turning differentiation into multiplication. However, in this context, it is typical that that which is prime, or fundamental, in one theory is composite in another. My own position on this is that you do not need formal duality in a string theory to get there, as even just the fact that one can change the bases in a field theory shows a certain arbitrariness in the choice of fundamental particles. However, the definition that is used in this more formal context is in regards to a specific property that the particles correspond to elements of a semi-simple decomposition of a Lie group associated with the theory. In a less formal sense, if a theory can be separated in components such that each can behave on their own in a way that does not require the others, then those components can be considered fundamental particles, perhaps separable particles. Hence, for a given choice of symmetry group, there is a definite collection of particles fundamental in this sense. The details are out of scope of this discussion. In the paper Nuclear Democracy by D. Kaiser, 2002, Kaiser mentions Geoffrey Chew as the moral owner of the concept. Professor Chew was the core player in the S-matrix theory. See also Flavor Democracy and Particle Physics by Satanosoi, 2007. The flavor democracy principle was introduced in the 1970s, There is also the recent theory that the proton might be a swarm of many particles rather than a stable combination of just three. So, the fight over the three principles versus the four materials is more a matter of choice of point of view than a serious issue with the physics. And modern string theory, with duality democracy, is just the most recent mode in which the argument over the existence of prime materials at all is being conducted. In the introduction to the copy of the Sceptical Chymist that I have, there is a statement that the core of the book is the fight between Hermetics and Spagorists. The introduction by Muir states, "On the face of it, no great interest seems to belong now to a discussion about the four elements and the three principles conducted at a time when physical science had not taken definite form, when men's ideas about the change of material things were vague and inchoate, when exact methods of investigating these changes were unknown, when moral qualities were attributed to inanimate objects, and the examination of natural events was regarded as part of contemplative philosophy rather than a branch of experimental inquiry. But let the question discussed by Boyle in the Sceptical Chymist be stated in their most general form, the importance and interest of them are seen to be great and universal." End of quote. Well, that was insulting. My thought here is that this is an illustration that the two models, the three principles and the four elements, are an example of particle democracy, and also that these models have much in common with modern quantum field theory in the sense that they are alternative collections of particles that might well give equal descriptions of nature. This is probably the biggest lesson learned from quantum mechanics in the 20th century, the idea of an effective field theory and then the more symmetric principle of duality. More than anything else, the mathematical study of the various quantum theories and their relation to each other and their relation to the classical theories has taught us that there might not be any fundamental theories at all, or at least that the choice of fundamental materials is a philosophical ontological choice rather than an empirical one. I'm not in the slightest suggesting that the medieval alchemists appreciated this point in the 12th century. Rather, I'm saying that in the 21st century, we should appreciate the fact that the alchemical theories decomposed materials into a different set of prime materials to those of the classical chemistry of the late 19th century. That does not mean that they were leading science up a dark alley, which we were lucky to escape. However, I'm saying that Muir appears to be saying that. Muir also says that Boyle promoted explicit science. The book is more than an elegant and suggestive discourse on chemical-physical matters. It is an elucidation of the true method of scientific inquiry, a powerful vindication of that method against the vain conceits of mere intellectualists, called by Boyle Hermetic philosophers, who would make paramount the authority of what they are pleased to call the divine reason of themselves or others like them. The Sceptical Chymist upholds the claim of the scientific method to be also the true method of philosophy, not only because of the universality and importance of the particular scientific questions wherein with it is concerned, but also because of the human interest that vitalize every attempt to determine the nature of truth and the ways of gaining truth. The Sceptical Chymist is a real living book for intelligent men and women today. End of quote. One thing I've learned is that just about everyone agrees with the principle of reasoning from the evidence. They mainly disagree on the importance of the different sources. While some suggest that excessively detailed abstract reasoning will lead you astray, no one suggests that their own kind of thinking is not reasonable. In the first part of the 21st century, I've heard many people support quantum theory in an armchair philosophical manner. They feel that they are thinking it through carefully. Some come to believe they understand the theory. Some come to believe that they can add to it. But the real theory is much more complicated and subtle than they imagine, and not a matter of fireside natural language chats, unless you already learned the mathematics. These armchair philosophers proclaim to subscribe to modern quantum theory, and yet the professional scientists and mathematicians would see them in the same light as Boyle sees the hermeneutic philosophers. The issue here is not so much the question of which theory one is following, but how it is implemented. The demon is in the details. Ultimately, the complaint that Boyle has against the hermeneutic philosophers is like that which Agricola has against the chemists of his day, that those people are repeating the old writings without really thinking it through. It is not so much their philosophical background, but how well they implement it. With some apologies to the density of quotes, there is another important point to make before leaving the introduction by Muir to the Sceptical Chymist. Muir states, "At that time, the time of Boyle, the alchemical scheme of things dominated most of those who were inquiring into the transmutation of material substances. That scheme was based on a magical conception of the world, that is, a conception of the world as the scene of drama, awful in its consequence, but simple in its setting and its unity, wherein man forms the central figure, which can be understood by looking inwards at one's own thoughts and emotions, discovering in these a guide to the unity of external nature, and the conception assumes the unity and simplicity of nature, and then forcing objective facts to take the form that is required by the intellectually constructed theory. When a magical theory of nature prevails, the impressions which external events produce on the senses of observers are corrected not by careful reasoning and accurate experimentation, but by inquiring whether they fit into the scheme of things which has already been elaborated and accepted as the truth. Natural events become as clay in the hands of the intellectual potter, for whom there is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so." End of quote. To paraphrase, Muir is saying, "They are wrong and I am right. They are wrong-headed and I am right-headed." But what really was the alchemical scheme? Did the alchemists ignore reality? In my own reading, I have found it advisable to notice that the alchemical scheme does not exist, any more than does the scheme of mechanics of the European Renaissance. That is, alchemy is a general topic, and in that topic will be found a multitude of practitioners and theoreticians who disagree with each other, sometimes profoundly. In the first half of the 17th century, it was over 50 years since Agricola had published De Re Metallica, in which was coined the name chemistry as a synonym for alchemy, and led to an intellectual schism between streams of thought. The practical empiricists tended to call themselves chemists, and the mystics tended to call themselves alchemists. Yes, while I object to the general use of the term alchemist to mean mystic, it does seem that in the 17th century this usage was indeed correct, or became correct as the century progressed. In the Summa Perfectionis of circa 1305, I did not find magical elements at all. I did not find analogies to the cosmos as being like the human body, and I did not find obscure images and riddles. What I found was a laboratory textbook on how to use a furnace to undertake studies in the properties of practical materials, along with some advice about being beware of the intellectual and financial hardships that the study might induce. But in several books of the 17th century, titled as Alchemy, I do find this kind of mumbo-jumbo about perfection of the soul and so on, and I find strange allegorical images that apparently became quite popular at the time. This is not to say that there was none of this in the 800s in the Arabic Peninsula, but the core then was in the practical studies, and the side issues and lesser books were on mysticism, just as there are books on quantum mysticism and consciousness in the early 21st century. The study that I'm undertaking here of alchemy covers the period from 500 BC to 1500 AD, which is 2,000 years of active alchemy by one or other of its etymological roots. Only 100 years, the 17th century, had alchemical mysticism while it was still in the mainstream, after which the term fell from grace and was clearly a matter of mystics, charlatans and frauds. The core issue is that to say that the alchemists in the 12th century were merely mystics based on the behaviour of those who called themselves alchemists in the 17th century is an unfair conclusion, to say the least. Muir then spends a lot of time dissing the alchemists and then praising Paracelsus in particular. Paracelsus is often thought of as a mystic or even a fraud who poisoned his patients. Indeed, there were accusations at the time. But in particular, Paracelsus, like Boyle and Agricola, distanced himself from those that he would declare to be alchemists, claiming to have some better ideas. In this context, it is interesting that Muir clearly sees Paracelsus as a hero of science. Now, Muir erratically quotes Boyle in line. In the Sceptical Chymist, Boyle pleads for lucidity of expression, for the destruction of tyranny of phrases, for clearing the mind of vague theories which rest on no basis of sound, tested experimental results. I have long observed, he says, that those dialectical subtleties that the schoolmen too often employ about physiological, we would say physical, mysteries are wont much more to declare the wit of him that uses them than increase the knowledge or remove the doubts of sober lovers of truth. And such capacious subtleties do indeed often puzzle and sometimes silence men, but rarely satisfy them. He accuses the chymists of his day of playing with names at pleasure. He says they write darkly, not because they think their notions too precious to be explained, but because they fear that if they were explained, men would discern that they are far from being precious. They would scarce keep themselves from being confuted. He exclaims, but by keeping themselves from clearly being understood, he will give no thanks to him who darkens what he should clear up, and makes me add the trouble of guessing at the sense of what he equivocably expresses. End of quote of quote. Pick up a random quantum book from the bookshelf in the early 21st century, and more than likely it will be quantum mysticism. It will be about consciousness, or about how quantum means we create reality with our minds, and how that means we can cause to come into existence whatever we want. At best, it will be a popular account by a somewhat reputable physicist, but popular accounts often do not follow the real research. The actual textbooks on quantum mechanics require a lot of mathematics and are for many people highly tedious and not filled with exciting conclusions about your love life. They are not self-help or feel-good books. They are hard work about reality. They talk about Schrödinger equations and operator theory, as well as Lie groups and algebras. It is the same with alchemy. The mystical books with strange pictures coming mostly from the 17th century are fun to read. They are often puzzle books which can give you a guilty pleasure at decoding the hidden messages, at seeing the obscure cross-references, and recognizing the phrases to tell you that you are in on the secret. But the actual practical alchemical textbooks, again I'll go with Summa Perfectionis, are laboratory textbooks. The Summa starts with a discussion of the practicalities of financing a study into material science and the details of constructing and using a furnace. It does not deny the idea that gold might be manufactured, but it said that it has not been done. The Sceptical Chymist is a dialogue. This is a venerable form. It was used by Plato and Agricola and would be used again by Galileo. But a strange thing about dialogues, it is rather rare to find that the speaker for the opposing view is entirely without straw veins. The discussion between Boyle and a philosopher in the Sceptical Chymist is a discussion between Boyle and what Boyle imagines a philosopher to be. Muir then, rightly in my opinion, criticizes people who use vague ideas and techniques of rhetoric in putting forward ideas that are difficult to refute because they are difficult to pin down. There are certain people who even see that vagueness as being a strength, people who feel that it is the poetic impact that is important, the mystical feeling that runs up your spine. The question, however, is whether the alchemists were really this. Certainly, as noticed, the neologism chemistry meant that those writers who wrote self-styled as alchemists were the less pragmatic kind, and even happy to promote that as a feature and not a bug. Muir complains that the alchemists talk about the soul of materials, and he claims from this that the alchemists had mystical and ill-formed ideas about the nature of materials. However, from readings in Robert Bacon in the 13th century and Pseudo-Geber in the 14th century, as well as checking some later compilations in encyclopedic form, it turns out that the spirit of material is that which is driven off by heat, and the body is that which is not. The term as used by the hardcore pragmatic alchemist was a technical term used to talk about the different empirical behaviours of the components. Consider that in modern theories the word attraction and repulsion, which are motive psychological words at root, are used to describe the two kinds of electrical interactions. The root meaning of the word sublime is to be grand and noble. It can mean an exaltation beyond human comprehension, but in chemistry it means to transfer from solid directly to gas without passing through a liquid phase. The analogy used to generate the term is clear, but that does not mean that the chemist is truly thinking that solid has been exalted. When I first started to try to understand the alchemists, I found a great deal of difficulty with the vocabulary. I found a similar problem with reading the works of Priestley, which I did before getting into alchemy, in trying to understand the altercation between Priestley and Lavoisier over the matter of phlogiston. I found that Priestley used, as a matter of standard diction, many words for materials and methods that were alien to me, while Lavoisier mostly used more familiar words. It turns out that this is because Lavoisier won the political battle that he started with the intention of changing the language to exclude the older works. After reading The Secrets of the Alchemist by Lawrence Principe, I was fascinated that not only would someone go to the effort of setting up a full alchemical laboratory to the original specification and then following the detailed instruction, but also that the experiments turned out to work as indicated, often being dependent on meticulous detail in the instructions. This was one reason why many chemists thought that the experiments were nonsense and the alchemists could not actually have tried it. I then took some time to chase up a variety of older and older books in the process of looking up what the older words had actually meant. Once I did find the appropriate references, I found that the works of the hardcore pragmatic alchemists were not mystical at all, but just a direct and non-obscure description of what they were doing in the laboratory, just in a language that had become antiquated without being impractical, a jargon that had been lost or was now misinterpreted.